Well, thanks very much, Terry, and it's an absolute pleasure for me to be back here in Cardiff. I'm based in Sydney, in Australia, and of course that's in the state of New South Wales. And so here I am in Old South Wales tonight, reflecting on these questions of sustainable placemaking. And in my 20 minutes, I originally trained as a medical doctor, and I wanted to give a particular perspective from human health, and framing it in this context of planetary health. So places in this broader context, and the key being that we all need to be thinking more deeply about safeguarding the health and well-being of current and future generations. And here in Wales, of course, with your well-being of future generations, you're ambitiously trying to step up internationally in this precise space. So it's terrific for me to be here learning with you. So I was pleased to be one of the commissioners on the Rockefeller Foundation Lancet Commission on Planetary Health, and that idea for that commission actually came from Richard Horton, who is the editor of the Lancet, and it was from a meeting in 2013 in China where the Rockefeller Foundation was reviewing their work over their first 100 years and reflecting on what they might focus on if they had 100 more years as a foundation. And Richard Horton made a compelling case for more focus on the ecological and social context of health. Because when we think about human health, we mostly tend to think about it through the lens of a contemporary biomedical understanding of health. And there's no doubt that biomedicine has made enormous strides in recent decades, and all of us in places like Wales benefit from those advances. But what we've lost in one sense is an understanding that human health and well-being fundamentally depends on the health of natural systems. For the air we breathe, the food we eat, as was pointed out in the previous presentation, all of the resources that we derive from nature are fundamental for our future health and well-being. And that's where this concept comes from. The report of the Commission was entitled Safeguarding Human Health in the Anthropocene Epoch, this new epoch in which humans are now changing Earth systems to such an extent that we'll see it in the fossil record. And the report was published in 2015. Here's a list of commissioners, and they come from a variety of disciplinary backgrounds and regions of the world. But the bottom line here on this slide is that this piece of work was essentially a review of literature and key policy recommendations. So it was building on previous work. The Brundtland Commission in the 1980s, remembering of course that Dr. Brundtland was a medical doctor before she was Prime Minister of Norway, and the work of the IPCC that includes work on health. Importantly, the work of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment when Kofi Annan was leading the UN, that really shone the light on these connections between health and ecosystems. But if we draw the lens back further historically, then in my field, in medicine, certainly Hippocrates is a key person. And so he's considered the father of medicine, and this is one of his treatises more than 2,000 years ago in ancient Greece on airs, waters and places. So here we are, Sustainable Places Research Institute, but we need to reflect back on this foundational thinking and reclaim that thinking and position it more centrally in our work today. And indeed, we can go further back. I happen to be born in New Zealand. My background is Ngāi Tahu Maori and Scottish, and Waiora is a Maori word from well-being. That's a composite word, wai meaning water and ora meaning life. And all Indigenous spiritual traditions are founded in an understanding of the connections between people and nature. So planetary health might be a new idea in academic circles and a new term that we're using, but these are definitely foundational understandings. So what were the findings of the Commission? We found that by almost any measure, the human population is healthier now than ever before. So this is World Bank data from 2011, and the black line there that you can see in the middle of the chart, the dates being from 1960 on the left through to 2010, you can see that through this phase, through this 50-year period, human health has been improving on average around the world. And in fact, when you look at all of those coloured bars, which are the different regions, those coloured lines, in every region, health has been improving. There's clearly still great inequity in Africa and South Asia, but health is improving through this phase. But in achieving those health improvements, we've exploited the planet at an unprecedented rate. So when we think about carbon dioxide emissions, ocean acidification, energy use escalating, global deforestation, water use, fertiliser use, the list goes on. And the idea of planetary boundaries, of course. Johan Rockström from Sweden advancing this concept that we're beginning to exceed the limits of the Earth system. And indeed, this whole idea of planetary thinking, moving from thinking about the global, which we've been focusing on. Some years ago, we focused on the international. Then we went through this strong focus on the global. But now the whole idea of the planetary thinking. What's different about that when we start to think in this way? So we defined planetary health at the Lancet Commission as the health of human civilization and the state of the natural systems on which it depends. And I can't expect you to see these links here in detail, but the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, around 2005, articulated this spectrum of links between environmental change and human health. With escalating pressures on natural systems, we're seeing a range of environmental changes, climate change being one important example, but also stratospheric ozone depletion, forest clearance, those boundaries that we mentioned before, and a range of health effects, direct, ecosystem mediated, and indirect. So a range of different pathways that we need to be considering. If we skip forward to the core conclusions, though, of the Commission, is that solutions do lie within reach. I think it's important for us to remember that we know enough to act. We don't need necessarily to put all our energy into new discovery research, new technologies. Much of what we need to do is already known. And so it's very much about putting that knowledge to effect. We found three broad sets of challenges. The conceptual challenges. And here I use the example of our focus on GDP as a measure of progress. And here tonight, if I was to give Terry $1 and say, Terry, do your best to increase GDP here in Cardiff, what would be the best thing for him to do? He could certainly, as a doctor, I could say, go and buy an apple. That'll keep you healthy, spend that dollar wisely. But if he was deliberately wanting to focus on GDP, the best thing to do would be to buy a box of matches and burn down this building. And the reason that would raise GDP is that within months, it would be rebuilt. And there would be economic activity here in Cardiff to rebuild the building. So clearly that is not progress. So I think it's a very clear example that GDP is not measuring progress, it's measuring economic activity. And so if we're to measure progress, we have to complement measures of our economic activity with measures of human development and measures of the state of the environment. So those are some of the conceptual challenges, the phase of imagination and thinking about what is actually progress. Secondly, the governance challenges. If you like, these are the phase of implementation. And here I refer to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act here in Wales, because we have big challenges all around the world, and the governance challenges are very much about the decisions we need to make in this context of uncertain futures, and also the decisions we need to make to invest across a range of portfolios in government. You know, how do we realise the synergies from investment in different sectors? And I think, as I mentioned earlier, that Wales, with this new 2015 legislation, essentially national legislation for sustainable development, we all need to be learning together about what's the difference when you're governing in the context of future generations, when you're thinking much more deliberately about what you're leaving behind for future generations. What will be different about the way Wales is governed? And then finally, the research and information challenges. And here tonight, we're focusing on bridging those disciplines because we've had this remarkable explosion of knowledge in recent decades during this period that's called the Great Acceleration since the 1950s, but we've ended up going down a range of different pathways in the different disciplines. And how do we bring that back together? Here's a link to the Lancet Commission report, and there's a range of useful infographics and other video information that's well worth having a look at when you get a chance. As I bring the threads together in this discussion, I want to point to this specific work, and it's some work I referred to in the new Handbook of Nature that Terry has been editing with the support of the team at Sustainable Places Research Institute in recent years, and just published. I think we saw the weighty tomes at the meeting. But in the contributions that I made, I referred to the work of this ecologist, Stephen Boyden. And in particular, I think this book is very important. The Biology of Civilization, Understanding Human Culture as a Force in Nature. So human culture is the problem, but importantly, human culture change can be the solution. A key in Boyden's work is this idea of a transition to biosensitive ways of living in ways that are in tune with nature. And this triangle, I think, is a very elegant communication device. Remembering that this is coming from an ecological perspective. And in ecology, we use the term human activities to describe everything that people are doing on Earth on any day, whether we're doing those things individually or collectively. And that everything that we're doing has the potential for positive or negative impacts on our health and well-being through a range of pathways, direct and indirect, but importantly also positive or negative impacts on the health of natural systems, and that there'll be feedbacks between these impacts. And then when we're thinking about sustainable places, we're thinking about developing places that will ultimately affect human activities. So we need to be thinking about these multiple pathways at once. Boyden also reminds us that when we're thinking about places and sustainable places, we need to remember the set of universal health needs that we all share. We tend to focus often on the biophysical when we're thinking about this. So the air we're breathing, the water we're drinking, the food we're eating, the pathogens we might be exposed to, the climatic conditions, but we perhaps are not focusing enough on the psychosocial needs here on the right. The need for an emotional support network, the experience of conviviality in our places, the opportunities for cooperation. How do we plan for that? How do we encourage it? How do we develop that within our places? And here's where systems thinking is very important. At the meeting today, we've been discussing this quite a bit. There's a number of important pieces of work happening at the Sustainable Places Research Institute. And the value of systems thinking is that it enables us to understand the dynamic interactions between decisions we might make in one sector and the range of potential implications of those decisions. It also enables us to understand the concept of feedback and how the things we do might propel a situation in a direction that we're not striving for. Policy resistance, why we're stuck. In my field, the obesity epidemic is a good example of we seem to be stuck despite a lot of investment in public health interventions, people are continuing to put on weight in most parts of the world. Leverage points, where are the opportunities for change? And then importantly, unintended consequences. Because in all of the work we do, we have to be alert for the fact that we could actually make things worse. If we come back to Hippocrates, a key is to first do no harm. And in relation to sustainable places, a couple of specific examples of these system problems. And if I use the example of unintended consequences, 200 years ago, here in Britain, there were very significant health problems in industrialising cities, and which led to the development of what was called the Garden Cities movement, ultimately. So urban planning, contemporary urban planning, the whole idea of a garden city was, at least in part, a response to these health challenges in industrial cities, where people were facing health problems from pollution, crowding, unclean water, lack of sanitation. Fast forward to the 21st century, that model of urban development was exported to my country, Australia, to Canada, to the United States, and then we had a new technology come along, the affordable motor car with Mr. Ford, and then suddenly urban sprawl took off and reshaped cities. And so an ideal that was in many ways a very sensible response to separate where people lived from where they worked in those industrial times and until the pollution could be controlled, has now ended up delivering a whole lot of new health problems. And many of you may have heard about the health impacts of urban sprawl, the sedentary living, a key part of the obesity epidemic, well documented now in North America and elsewhere. Obviously great concerns about air pollution in many parts of the world as a result of motor vehicle emissions, and indeed mental health challenges in this context. So unintended consequences, an intervention that was meant to make things better, actually leading to a whole new set of problems. Feedback, this is very dear to my heart in Australia, this example, climate change increasing the intensity of heat waves, which is leading to increased demand for air conditioning, thereby increasing energy use and greenhouse gas emissions from climate control in homes and workplaces. And indeed, it's led to our government recently being concerned about energy security and quite dysfunctionally proposing to invest in new coal-fired power stations. And it's just, you couldn't imagine anything more ludicrous. But there's things that we can do to cool down our cities naturally, by growing more vegetation, designing the buildings differently, orienting them differently, and Terry's group has funding from the British Council to look at this in both the Asian context, where these issues are critically important, as well as a local context. So a few final words about the approach that we're taking to bringing the disciplinary perspectives together. We're using an approach we call collaborative conceptual modelling, developed by Barry Newell and Katrina Proust at Australian National University. And it's a 6-step process with 2 phases. So in the first 3 steps, we're trying to understand conceptually what's going on from different disciplinary perspectives. So firstly, at the top there, what is the challenge? Defining the problem and thinking about the same problem from the variety of different perspectives, then what is the story? Remembering that there's always a history that's relevant. How did we get here? Why are we in this situation? And then thirdly, can I see how you think? Can we draw this as a set of influences? And can I, as a doctor, see how the urban planner thinks about the same problem? And then the second phase, which is when we can begin to quantify and model what's going on, what's driving system behaviour, point 5, the step 5, where are the leverage points, where are the opportunities for change, and then notably step 6, can we see with new eyes? So we're looking at a problem, can we reflect on that and learn from it? I think this is either my final slide or my second last slide, and this brings us back to Stephen Boyden's work, and I realise certainly down the back it'll be hard for you to see, but this is our attempt at a conceptual framework for the total system that I think is helping us, certainly in the work we're doing at the University of Sydney, to understand how these various eco-social influences come together, and notably the importance of human culture. So over here, the cultural system, the cultural options, in the first box here, human culture, our worldview, what we know, what we believe, what we prioritise. There are options here, and inevitably we make choices. And what we choose here will affect the way we organise ourselves in our society. The governance arrangements we put into place, the economic system, the regulations, and our education system, what we teach future generations about. Those cultural options, though, importantly, will ultimately affect a range of biophysical options. The human population, the number of people, how they group, the densities, the things people do collectively, the fuels we're using, how we manufacture, how we farm, and the things we do as individuals, our lifestyles, our livelihoods, how we travel, and the things we make, the artefacts, the buildings, the roads, the vehicles. Those biophysical options, of course, affect the broader biosphere, the biophysical environment, if you like, with its physical elements, the atmosphere, ocean, clay and rocks, and the living elements, the plants and animals and microorganisms. So this is a schema for the total system, but the bottom line here is that the health of humans and other animals and more generally natural systems, the health of soil, the health of the climate system, if you like, are emergent properties from the way this works. And when we're thinking about sustainable places, we need to keep these in mind because we're essentially thinking about how we optimise this sort of system in the interests of future generations. Oh, here's my final key messages. Arguably, my discipline, medicine, has been part of the problem in sustainable placemaking. And I say that because of the contemporary focus on biomedical understandings of health. As important as they are, they don't allow us to take this broader ecosystem perspective on health. That said, although we're part of the problem, we can be part of the solution, and we should be, because human health is a natural integrator. Ultimately, when we're thinking about our places, we're developing those places, we're thinking about them deeply, at least partly in the interests of human health, well-being, security, opportunity in our places. And so they are natural integrations. And my core message, I think, from the talk is that human ecology and systems thinking complement epidemiology for understanding human health in this sustainable development discourse. So thanks very much.